Greetings. I'm Steve, and I'd like to thank you for joining the Architect and the Executive podcast, where we discuss technology, philosophy, leadership, personal development, and much more. The theme for each episode varies as we endeavor to examine various topics from our unique points of view. I hope you enjoy this episode of The Architect and the Executive. In this episode, which is part 2 of our series on low code at scale, we talk about the challenges of going low code. Topics include recruiting, building a team, training your developers, DevOps, hosting, testing, QA, and especially understanding the Mendix way. We hope you enjoyed this episode of The Architect and the Executive. Wardrobe and styling for this episode provided by Glow Your Soul, your one-stop shop for custom t-shirts, mugs, cups, candles, and jewelry. Glow Your Soul also provides massage therapy and Reiki healing. Check them out at glowyoursoul.com. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to another episode. Imran, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Steve. How are you on this wonderful Friday?
Man, having a great day. It's been a wonderful week. I'm super excited to pick up where we left off from our last episode, talking about low code at scale and diving into the challenges that we see and that we've run into over the past few years, where, last episode we talked about the benefits and how do you know. But here we want to share some of our experience on the challenges and some of the other things to be thinking about as you're diving in, head first into a low-code project.
That's right, Steve. And I think it's important to mention that these are, I think, challenges that you'd face no matter what type of software project you were going for, what technology, when you want it to be enterprise class and be done at this level.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And we're going to, start obviously with recruiting, because you have to have the right people. But that's true to your point of every software project. If you're going to go write something in Ruby and you don't have Ruby developers, you're going to have a bad time, right? It's just not going to go well. So, as I think about it here, the hard part is how do you go find Mendix talent or low code talent, right? We talked last time about how many different platforms there are, but it is new. It's an emerging market. It's a growing kind of thing. So how do you go find people that are already doing it? And then, how do you find them? How do you onboard them? And, my first challenge when we got into this was that the community for Mendix especially is small. I came from a Microsoft background, and there's millions of people that do Microsoft, and there's probably millions of people that do Java, but there are hundreds of thousands of people that do Mendix, right? It's not millions, and it's probably not 500,000. It's probably, 200,000, 300,000 people that we would consider the Mendix community.
So I'll give you some stats on that. I had looked it up for another presentation I was doing. So at the time, the Mendix community was boasting a membership of about 120,000 worldwide members. And that's, people who are been involved. By contrast, I Googled how many Java developers there were in the world, and the result was about 9 million. So you can see there's just a little bit of a difference in the size of the market there.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
So it's a growth opportunity. All right.
Yeah, definitely room to grow.
That's pretty funny. I didn't realize it was that big of a difference, but that's definitely it is a growth opportunity, right? It's a chance for somebody to go and really do something and be in a market where there isn't, there are not all the paths have not been blazed. So that's kind of exciting, but it is a challenge because that does mean that there's fewer folks out there that are going to be, applying for those jobs that will already have experience. One of the things that I don't think we've touched on anywhere else is what does it take to be a Mendix developer? And you really can have any sort of background. What do you think about for a background?
Someone who is really tech savvy, right? We talked about the super Excel user in the last episode, but anyone who has an understanding of object-oriented programming, and you don't have to already, but if you did, you could easily learn Mendix. It's just another way to program in that way. But if you didn't, but you understood the concepts well enough, and even though you weren't able to learn how to code, or it was just not something you were interested in doing, then Mendix might be a good tool for you to say, be able to build apps with those concepts and not have to worry about the coding aspect of it.
So are there training plans then, from Mendix? How do you learn to get in to Mendix? If you say you have a good background in Python, how are you going to go translate that?
the Mendix Academy. It's the easiest place to start. So academy.mendix.com, and it's totally free to sign up and take all the trainings. But they actually have a quick crash course, which it's one of their learning paths, and it's for people who are programmers, and it'll take you and kind of explain to you Mendix really quick in those same terms. And then they have their Rapid Developer course and the Advanced course online, which you can do all the coursework for, and all the coursework is free. And then, you would just, if you wanted to get the certification, of course, you'd have to pay a fee. But yeah.
Right. I think when I started working with Mendix, that's what I did, was their crash course. Then I did the Rapid Developer. Although I don't think I've ever actually taken the exam. I really should go get that done. But it's a really good point that you make, that there is a really good academy. Mendix puts out a ton of training materials on how to learn how to do different things. And I think that does give you some trajectory for a career path, right? If you want to go from, into a developer and then build your skills, through the Mendix platform, you can do that. They have multiple levels of certification.
So you asked a question, right? Where do Mendix developers come from? So there's a couple of different places where we're bred, right? One is a company that hires Mendix. Mendix will generally send people on site to train staff in Mendix, right? The courses are pretty quick. It's the same courses you can get online, but once you engage with them, that's generally what you're going to do. You'll have some Mendix consultants engage with you in the beginning to help you get started and help you get your first apps off the ground. And then ultimately the people that you train in-house kind of take over and they become Mendix developers, right? And the other way is through Mendix partners. So you have big firms like Man Systems, Time Series, who offer Mendix services, right? And they have training programs where they create Mendix developers. So different types of people go to them. They might be college interns. They might be people who want a career change, whatever it is, can go. And then you have these consulting firms that have most of your Mendix developers. There are a lot of independent consultants who generally either started off as Mendix employees or part of these other firms and have kind of branched out on their own, and they're out there in the world floating. But when it comes to a talent pool, when you're looking at, we want to hire Mendix developers, that is a totally different beast, right? Because you can come in and train Mendix developers, and that's great if you have a few Mendix apps. But once you get larger and you get to a point, especially when you have everything running on Mendix and you actually want to build a large, sophisticated professional development team, then you need to go start hiring talent. So then senior Mendix developers are really hard to find.
That's definitely been our experience, right? Finding, and I guess that's sort of true. We hoard some resources. We have quite a few advanced developers, really good senior Mendix folks, but they were hard to find. It's definitely not something that you're going to get on, everybody's resume without a doubt.
Yeah, or when you post a job, there's not hundreds of resumes flying in, right? There are more and more, but not as many as you'd expect. And the third place that they come from are from universities. So a lot of Mendix has a very robust university program. I think there's over 100 colleges and universities who participate, and that number grows daily. But a lot of professors are starting to teach Mendix as part of their curriculum to MIS students and computer science students. And, we even started a college internship program at EXP to facilitate part of this process, right? And a lot of the big players, the big partners, will also engage with universities in their area to help with some of that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think it's one of the cooler things we did in 2019, right? Was roll out that intern program for helping to build the next wave of developer that's going to be working in Mendix and low code, and really give them the experience of what is it like to deliver software on a day-to-day basis, which I hope for those folks that participated, they had a really good time with it.
Right, I think they did. And it was more, and you said that it's very important. It was not a Mendix internship, it was a software delivery internship. And they happened to learn Mendix along the way. But they all walked out of here with the Rapid Developer Certification, and so a few more are out there in the field now, right? I think we hired one of them. And
we did.
The others are still out there. So,
but they also got to spend time, and to your point though, they got to spend time in agile ceremonies. They got to spend time seeing product stories being written and tested. Like they got to be part of that whole thing. And I think the again, not really a challenge of low code, but when you're working at scale and you're recruiting talent, you do have to have a plan for how are you going to grow and mentor and help your people advance. And that was part of what we were doing at the very beginning, right? Of right off from intern to fully functioning developer. And that was part of our larger education plan.
Yeah, it's a very small world when it comes to the Mendix community, as you mentioned, right? So I have a funny story that I'm going to share. I'm obviously going to change names and everything like that to protect people, but we were hiring and we were going for some candidates, and there was one in particular who we were about to give an offer to, and before we could put the offer together, we weren't fast enough. He was off the table. He's sent an email, thank you, I found another opportunity, but I really appreciate your time and everything, but I'm gonna go down this road. So cool, all right, great, no big deal. A couple of weeks later, I'm having dinner with a colleague of mine who has another small Mendix consulting firm, an SAP consulting firm, and we're talking, and he's telling me about this new hire he's got, and I'm like, oh, I caught the first name, and I was like, could you say that again? And he repeats it. And I was like, I know that name. Yeah. And he was like, yeah, I know you do. And I kind of, we knew that it was in the works and we had to move fast. And, but it's one of those things where it's a small world. And at the end of the day, we can sit and, have a beer and laugh about it. But, to go to the case in point here is that, there are not a lot of people out there and there's a lot of competition for them.
Yeah, I think the thing that we've seen over the last, COVID has put a slight damper on it, but we've seen over this year, there's some pretty major players getting involved in trying to build out, Mendix consultancy or building a better practice internally. So the demand for talented, capable Mendix developers is high. And again, that's something you have to think about. I think back 20 years on a project I was working on, and we were looking for really high-end Java developers. And at the time, that was a really, really small market. And the couple of people that we looked at, they commanded a considerable price at the time. Well, economics aren't the same anymore, and there's a lot more people even in this market now. But it's still, from a competition speed, as you're thinking and planning out your strategy for how do you build that team, you do have to take that in mind, right? You need HR to be your partner in your company to turn an offer around and make sure that you're making a competitive offer. And, with EXP, we have some pretty great benefits about the fact that we are pushing the bounds, at least in our minds, of what Mendix can do. Mm-hmm. And we do a lot of things in Mendix. So if you want to do cool things, you really want to work with us. And that helps. Plus the fact that we're completely remote makes a huge difference, especially with all the lockdowns and the restrictions and whatnot. But you have to have that whole package put together. You're not just going to go step into low code and be like, yeah, let me get a guy. It'll be easy, right? You have to plan for what that is. And like I said, I think we've done a good job, but for folks listening who are thinking about it, that is like you would go into any new territory, any new language, you do need to have a plan for how am I going to get the right people, train them, grow them, and then treat them well enough that they don't want to leave and that they can know they can advance their career with you, right? That's a piece of it. Everybody wants to grow.
Right. Aside from working at Mendix themselves or with one of the big partners we mentioned, you're not going to find a big career path as a Mendix developer at a lot of other places. A lot of customers use it for either more minimal work or they have smaller shops or they're smaller companies that are doing it. Right. And there might just be a few people who are working together. But for a place where we have a career path, and we designed a career path all the way from college intern through senior engineer, architect, and manager and beyond. And it's a place to grow as a low code and a Mendix developer. It's a new world and there's a new breed of developers out there and they need a place where they can grow and grow their careers.
Yeah. And we look to grow the whole person, right? Mm-hmm. You're not just growing in low code. While you'll learn more and you'll push those boundaries, you'll also learn about being a member of a team, maybe leading a team, leading a project, right? That it's that whole, to your point, it's that whole growth right up through, senior dev into a management role, if that's the direction you want to go, which I think is that would kind of be the EXP way, right? That's our That's our thing. And which kind of brings me to our next topic, which is the Mendix way.
Mhm.
And that's been, I think, probably the hardest thing for me is learning, having the Microsoft mentality for so long about how you do things, trying to really shift that to what's the right way to do it in low code and what's the right way to do it according to Mendix. How do they think about this particular topic and what's the right methodology to get where you want to go to be successful? And that's been a challenge for me, for sure.
I get a mixed response from developers when we talk about Mendix, right? On some parts, there are things that would have been very complex to do in a traditional coding environment that Mendix makes really easy. And
Right.
then there are some things that would have been really easy to do in a traditional coding environment that Mendix might make a little more convoluted, right?
Yep.
And the idea is that there's a lot more that you can do quickly with less skill sets up front, right? But you got to take it for what it is and don't make it something it's not. It's something I always say is when you learn Mendix, you have to learn it as a pure form. Just you're learning Mendix. Don't think that you're doing something else in Mendix. You're learning Mendix.
Right. It's not another flavor of C#, right? It's not going from C# to Java. It really is a whole new language. It's Java to Ruby or to Python or to something else. It's not the same thing. And I think, you mentioned your story earlier. I think back to one of the first conversations you and I had with Mendix as we were talking about the apps and trying to get a feel for what was going on. I had said to them, what sort of access do I need to give to my DBA, right? My database administrator? What sort of access should that, a person in that role have? And I think we were on a video call because I saw some heads just kind of go, do I know? I was like, the DBA, they're like, oh, why would you need a DBA?
Right.
Like, we handle a lot of that. And that really threw me off. And I think you and I probably talked about it for probably an hour after that. And you're like, yeah, no, we don't really need one. It's not that kind of thing, which is another part of the topic, another part of the challenge where you do need to think about it differently. But at the same time, you also need different skill sets. So, when you think about those people you're trying to bring on in the community, that Mendix developer works on the front end. They do the UI. To your point, some of the stuff is really easy. They also work on the data model. They work, the presentation layer. They work on the business layer, and they work on the database layer, top to bottom. You don't have to have those 4 specialized roles on your team to do something in Mendix. One person really can get in there and dive in and do all the aspects of it. But it does require a different mindset.
Right. And it's evolved. When early versions of it came out, I equate it to other things like SharePoint, right? In the early versions, you had to do a lot of work in front page and you had to do a lot of work. And if you really wanted to customize it, you had to pretty much be a full-on .NET developer. And the more you go, the newer versions came out, the more you could do in the UI and the more the low-code developer was empowered. And Mendix was the same way. I think in the early versions of Mendix, you drew a visual microflow with actions in it, but they were just packed with Java code, right? And so it's kind of a way to construct your code and your model, but you still had to code a lot of things. And then as time has gone by, more and more things are built into the modeler with native support. So today, you can publish an entire REST service with like 3 or 4 button clicks. And it'll do a lot of the stuff for you in the background with setting up your methods and your calls. And you have to go in and put some customization as far as what's happening under the hood. But a lot of the mechanics of things, it's going to set up for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the framework, right? The scaffolding is all built in. I thought when you and I were talking earlier this week, that was a great example of having to write all the Java actions in early Mendix, and now it's all there. And if you're doing Java actions in this case and you're writing your own code, it's because you're really trying to extend it and take it further, right? We're looking at process queue and a new version of a process queue, and as we talked about that earlier this week, you were explaining that that's how that one is now. You got to do a lot of the work on your own, but we know that Mendix will continue to extract or kind of separate you from having to do the more detailed work, and as they make it truly low code.
Right, the task queue. So we're working in this new module, and it's a beta test, so it's not fully fleshed out yet. But it's almost just like we're doing a proof of concept. So they created the framework for it, and they gave me a module. But in order to implement it, I have to write like 3 lines of Java code, which once they fully flesh it out and put it into native support in the next version of the modeler, that line, even doing any of that Java writing will be gone, right? It'll all be configurable through the UI.
Yeah, and I think the thing that really jumped out at me as we were talking about that is the idea of what low code is really doing. And we touched on, the stack, the 6 or 7 network different layers or application stack. And really low code is all about extracting or abstracting the really low level stuff further and further away. And we joke about the Mendix way, but you do have to understand how Mendix expects things to work as they've done their extraction. So if they've intentionally hidden some sort of inner functionality that you might have had to write yourself, you need to know how they want that to work so that you can be successful. And the farther away you get from, writing that assembly level code, the more you need to understand their intent. And that was actually a different way of thinking about it for me as you and I were talking earlier this week to prep for this episode, right? That I hadn't really ever thought about it that way. And I think it's a lesson that anyone thinking about any low code platform should really think about. And I'm sure that's true of any language, right? You think about Go, what is it you're trying to do in there and how is that language built and what was it built for? It's probably got a special reason or things it's really good at. And Mendix is the same way. And understanding what the mindset maybe of the people who are doing that engineering helps for you to really get into how can I go make the most of what they've done for me. Right.
And I think that was one of the first things I told you when we got together or started working on the project together, and you were new to Mendix, and I tell this to everyone, I was like, listen, there's a way to do something, and then there's a Mendix way. And it is just going to be, we talk about acceptance, right? And being at peace in the moment. You just got to accept that there's a Mendix way. And then once you do that, and that's, for me, like I said, we talked about this. I don't have a traditional coding background, not professionally anyway, right? And so I didn't come in with a lot of habits. And I'm not even going to say good or bad because they're not good or bad, but I didn't come in with any coding habits. Right. And so when I learned Mendix, I was like, cool, that's how you do it. Right. and that was it. And so that's why it made it so easy for me to just understand and master the modeler.
And that's been an interesting, point of view for us, right? The whole reason that we do this podcast is because we have similar experiences from completely different points of view.
Right.
And that's another one. I have been doing development for a long time. I took some computer science, but again, as I mentioned before, I have a degree in chemistry. But I was a developer for a really long time. I know several languages and I know how things work. And I've thought a lot about if you're doing something, here's how it should be done. And there were things that we've done in Mendix that I bristled against. And I'm like, no, you don't, that's not how this works. And you're like, okay, take a step back, take a deep breath and accept that this is the way it's done in Mendix and let's figure out how to make the most of it. And, I mean, those are frustrating to me, but they're also points that I have to remember. Okay, yeah, you're right. That is how this needs to go. But that's a challenge of, again, any language. But you have, I think, less control over what you can influence in a low-code platform. There's only just so many things that you can really go and change. I think back to when you and I were looking at the button problem that we had where people were clicking in white space and it was unselecting a checkbox. And I'm like, right. I know how this works. So clearly this is how you do it in JavaScript, how you make that white space clickable. Let's just go turn that off. And you and I dug in over the course of like an hour and we realized that it was literally the module piece for making that did it. And there was no way to turn it off.
We had no control over it anyway.
Yeah, no control. So we would have literally had to go rewrite, I don't even know how many different things to create our own basically checkbox selector with a label that was completely different, that didn't allow the white space to be clickable.
Right.
Or we could rearrange the page so that there was a lot less white space.
Right. One of the two.
And we went with how do we do it with slightly less white space and a better understanding. And we put some things around that button and said, hey, if this is changed, we should tell people because they might have clicked it accidentally and not meant to change it.
Right.
And again, that was the Mendix preferred way, even though had we been doing it in just straight up JavaScript, we would have fixed it in 10 minutes.
Right.
But it wasn't that, right? To your point much earlier, that there's just some things are harder and some things are easier. It's easy to show a list of options and put a checkbox on the field with a label, but you can't customize a lot about how that space around it works and what that looks like.
Right. So another consideration, right, when we're deciding what to use or how to implement this is infrastructure. And that's always a thing. Doesn't matter what language, what technology you're going to build on. You got to decide, how are you going to host these apps? How are you going to make them available? It's become its own discipline, right? DevOps engineer. You didn't hear that word years ago, 10 years ago, 15, 20, right? No, it was there were system administrators who ran your servers, right? And that was it. But you kind of just figured it out. So in Mendix, there's a couple of different ways that you can do this. There's the Mendix Cloud, the public cloud, which you can easily just spin up an app and host in and host a lot of stuff in. But it has its challenges, right? If you're doing a large enterprise-wide implementation, you're very limited in kind of what you can do, right? What are some of the challenges, Steve, that we ran into with the Mendix Cloud?
Man, so that, we've talked about it a little bit here and there. We mentioned, I think, our transition from Cloud V3 to V4, the having the platform as a service, which we touched on last week, which is a huge benefit, is also one of our bigger challenges. We don't host our own, right? We're not a self-host. We don't do on-prem, is what they call it, on-premises hosting. We use their cloud. And the challenges we've had are related to, I'll say, permissions about who can do what and the roles that are available. Again, Mendix thinks about how their projects and their software will be used in really specific ways. And I don't think we fit that model really well. With the way that we had development and the different roles in the project. For Mendix, you have like a Scrum Master and a business engineer and a few other things. And those roles are kind of built in with permissions in the cloud and what they can do. Who can configure an app that's running in production? Who can deploy an app that's running in production? As, someone who's responsible for the uptime of that app, that stops with me. I really want to know who can go edit those things, right? I don't want a lot of changes to happen. I want that locked down. And that was really hard, right? We learned about the whole concept of technical contact. And for a long time, you as our, lead dev, architect, engineering manager, were also technical contact, which puts us in a bind because now you can write code and you can deploy code, which gives me and I don't know if we'll touch on it too much today, but maybe we'll save it for another conversation. But the idea of, how do you do things in an audit and compliance environment? Boy, when you have a developer who can write their own code, check in their own code, approve it, and deploy it, that's great in a startup, but not when you get to the enterprise level. You really need to be able to limit that. So we had to find a way to bring our VP of IT into the loop and get our system reliability engineers involved and really change how we thought about deploying and who could do it. And, I think, what would you say, maybe a year, we used to take away the permissions for deployment, except for really specific times when we knew we were going to deploy. Then someone would go grant it to either you or another developer who was going to do the deployment. And then we take it away again, because that was the only way we could get around it. That's a challenge, right? That's something you need to think about if you're using the Mendix Cloud. And while the tools make it easy to deploy, there's not a lot of granular control around how do you work in that environment and still follow some procedure, best practice, compliance type things.
Right. And we definitely learned that the hard way. I came from smaller environments where at my first place I learned Mendix or worked with Mendix, I also managed the servers. I had happened to switch from becoming a system administrator to a developer, right?
Right.
And so I just offered to do it, and it just worked out that way. And then when I worked at my next client, they were hosting in the Mendix cloud, my first experience there, but they had one or two small apps. And the idea behind the cloud is it does make it easy for the developer to deploy and manage those types of things without having a lot of other technical skills, right? The whole idea behind the low code in programming is that the cloud provides you that ease when it comes to DevOps and deployments, one-click deployments and all that. So cool. So naturally, it seems like that's the fit, right? The Mendix developer can also manage the Mendix cloud, and it's totally doable. And when you're at a smaller organization, that makes a whole lot of sense. What we learned as our organization grew is that having one person do that was a bottleneck for one on things, and it was just definitely too much to do. It was becoming its own full-time thing. To right now, we have a team of like 3 or 4 people that handle it, right? As we went from one app to 2 to 3 to 20 plus, it just became, it became a single point of contact for support issues, access issues, creating containers, moving containers, backing up, restoring things. When we did environment refreshes, that was actually probably the first thing that really triggered me to help moving this off. And I had none of the audit concerns you did. It was just a matter of the time I spend in my day and my growing list of tasks I had as an architect, engineering manager, developer. Just those things were going away. And then now, of course, I'm doing every deployment. And so now we're deploying 4, 5, 6 apps in a night, maybe. We have multiple things going on. They all have tasks to run, scripts to run. So now it's just hard to keep up with.
Yeah, or you're deploying every night, right? We might deploy Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday nights, right? And if you're the only person who can do it, you're available, right? Doing those things at 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night so that we're outside of Windows. That's a big problem. I think you touched on it too, the creating a container or requesting a container or doing those sorts of things. We have things a little different with Mendix, but for the most part, if you want help from Mendix, they're expecting that one person is the primary contact, right? The technical contact should be the one interacting with Mendix to get support because they're expecting that you will have already done all the troubleshooting. When I submit a ticket, they're like, well, did you really, troubleshoot this? They know now, but they don't expect that. So that's another piece that in a smaller company, if you're working on, making a transition, you do have to figure that out. How do you have that one person that can be all of those things? Because it is more, especially if you put it into production. Now that technical contact is really the one responsible for it, top to bottom, whatever is going on.
Yeah, and if you're a large enterprise, I think it just makes sense that you maintain your own infrastructure either way. I know that there's value in hosting in the cloud and the ease of it. Mendix does provide VPC options. They also do provide your ability to have an instance of the Mendix cloud in your own AWS subscription so that you can use their cloud tools if you want to keep the workflow and the stuff for deployments and things like that and creating releases without it being in their house. And so the idea is that you would still have full control over your environment and the backend behind it. Because the other part about the cloud is that everything behind that interface is a black box to you. You don't have access to it. You don't have access to your database. You can download backups of your data, but you don't have access to your data. You don't have access to your app servers. You don't have access to the underlying Cloud Foundry and AWS layers that are driving everything, just to that Mendix cloud portal.
And that's been a challenge for us recently, right? As we've been, we have some pretty complicated apps that run in Mendix, and we really need the ability to see everything that's happening, right? And when all of a sudden we have a problem and we can't watch the live data, right? It's not an option. It's not available because that is in the Mendix cloud. That's a challenge. But again, that's not something you're necessarily going to think about when you're trying to decide what you want to build. That comes much later when you realize that all your troubleshooting, you're missing that one piece of what's really happening at the data layer right now. What's this request that's running? I think back to last year, we had the problem where we had a queue that kept getting the same message in it. And while we thought we were getting past it, it was really one message that was trying to do this one thing that was taking the site down. We just couldn't see it. We had no visibility of what that was until we learned, we found other ways to go look at what could be running. And that's, again, That's what we're
A little
talking about
trial
today
and
is what
error
are the
we had to do.
challenges?
Yeah.
How do you get around that? I think you mentioned it a little, but think about the amount of time that you spent and then that transition to, to Tom, who runs that piece now. That, what would you say if you just had to ballpark it, the amount of time before you transition you were spending in a week on being the technical contact?
I think it was about 60% of my day. And, or just if you look at my whole week and if you looked at the things that I was doing there versus other things, it was a good percentage. I remember telling you the first week after we had transitioned everything over, and I'm almost thankful for the audit because that was the excuse through which I was able to hand off all these permissions,
Right.
because I know I kept coming up as the singular person who had way too many permissions, and I fully agreed with all of that. So
Yep.
here we go. Here's an opportunity. Now we have to, and we have to kind of do it. But we had to take some time, take some training. Like for me, I had grown used to it. So I didn't get 24 apps handed to me at once. I grew
Right.
from 1 through
Right.
24. And then, even working with Mendix at previous employers and customers, clients, and, had the experience with it. But we all of a sudden handed over management of 80% of our cloud apps to our DevOps team, who up until then were focused on our internal AWS infrastructure and managing the things that we do have control over.
Right.
And now we had to bring them in, but we had to bring in the Mendix stuff to all the other things, right? Monitoring, alerting, and then to the point of them doing the deployments. So even the developers started helping me out. I'm not saying that I was doing all the deployments for every single app, but what I would do, to the point that you mentioned, is I would assign permissions in the moment to people who could help with deployments, and then I would remove people's permissions so that there was no one who had permissions all the time, and it had to be documented when permissions were given and taken away, right? And that was the first attempt at it, our first go at the audit control, right? To at least have some control over it. But ultimately, that one thing was still there, was I was still there in the middle of it.
Because you could check in code, again, not a Mendix problem, right? But for people who are in a big, controlled environment, you don't want someone who can check in code to be able to deploy their own code. That's pretty standard. People, I'm sure there are a lot of people listening to this going, oh, yeah, that's a huge problem. We have it too. You got to figure out how to get around that. And that's, again, not the Mendix way, but it's, how do you do that? It would still be a problem even if we were on-prem, right? But again, now you have a little bit more control over what you're doing. You might have some more flexibility on who can SSH to a box and run a program and that sort of thing. You have a different set or a different style of control that you can use that's not necessarily directly related to the, node permissions that you have at using the Mendix Cloud. And I think that's the other big thing that we've had as we've grown to so many apps, is that managing and reporting on those node permissions is a challenge, big time. That when we have to show it, it's literally screenshots, and that's not great. But it works, but it takes time to show who has that access every time.
And it's not always clear, right? Mendix has this single support model, but we're kind of jumping into audit. I know it's on the DevOps side, though, it really, you can take advantage of the newer processes that are out there, right? Dockerizing things, having infrastructure as code, managing your pipeline. So this goes back to how we were talking about how we involve Mendix in the software development lifecycle. And, the main point we made was it replaces one aspect of it, right? The development. And everything else still remains in how you manage development, how you manage your releases and products and all that. On the infrastructure side, it should be viewed exactly the same way. Mendix doesn't take over everything. It takes over one aspect of it, right? But when you look at your DevOps process and your pipeline management and the workflows that you create from getting from environment to production, and how you run through things like testing and, code reviews and all that, those workflows can still be as generic and as best practice as AWS provides or whatever your cloud provider is. Mendix works with many. We've mentioned AWS and Mendix Cloud, but they work with all the big cloud providers that are out there, Cloud Foundry, HP, Azure, things like that. I think Google Cloud support's coming out soon, but so you can still, and that's what I would recommend at the large enterprise level, is maintain your own DevOps functions, right? and then just use the pieces of Mendix that are useful to you and bring Mendix into your DevOps function. Don't bring your DevOps function into Mendix.
Right. You touched on a really interesting point that I'd like to dig into a little bit, though, is that pipeline. Yeah. Right. And how do you really get testing and QA and environments? And, as I think about where I was before EXP, we had a lot of environments. I think we had 4 separate QA environments, so we could have the current version we were testing, the current production version, and the previous production environment, and one more for special projects. They were all the same. And then we had all of our production environments. You still need that same sort of thing as you're thinking about, a Mendix app. Again, to your point, it only replaces the development piece. And now you have to be able to put code perhaps in a development or maybe a test environment as your first level where you're outside of the local developer's machine. And you need to do your integration and make sure that everything works. You have to have an environment for that. You have to have a process around how am I going to test that and what does it mean? Do I do unit testing? Do I do automated testing? And where? And then you need to be able to test your deployment process. That was something we had to institute of how do we make sure that when we go from our last environment into production, that we've done all the things and we know all the steps, all the deployment steps that have to happen. Well, you should test that. When you move from test to QA, you should be testing your deployment scripts, and it should follow the same procedure so that you're documenting all of those things out. Again, that's not a challenge of Mendix. That's a best practice of how do you deploy things. But you do need to work in your process for how do I make testing work? It's not as simple as some things. You can still script it some. I think we mentioned previously, but there's a tool out there called ATS. I think that's Automated Test Service, maybe from Man Systems. Sweet. Yeah, I think you're right. That's from Man Systems. It does help with automated testing. I think just from the feedback that I've seen and the way we used it, it was still kind of hard. I know at least at one point we also included BrowserStack that we used to do some automated testing, and it runs some scripts, and that may still be the case. And then we'd be remiss not to mention our other QA partner, which is Indium Software. Right. And they have a product, I think it's called iSafe, that we do a lot of automation in. But again, it's a challenge to test, right? The names of buttons, you don't necessarily have to name the button you put on the page. It could just end up being button 6. And you need to go click it. So in your automated script, you're like, I got to find button 6 because I know that's what it looked like. But then the next time you might add another button, and button 6 is now button 12. And Mendix did the build. It doesn't matter to Mendix. It knew how to tie all those things together. But now the code that you had that was looking for button 6 doesn't work. Right. And you have to then go back and rework that test. And I know that happens in every language, but I think the ease of the visual modeler in Mendix makes that harder. Like that just, it exacerbates that piece of it that you really have to go back and work. And I know if we had Sherry, our QA manager, she'd probably have a lot of comments about, how easy or hard or, how much of a challenge it could be to test. But because you can do so many things and it's not always directly obvious, you can't just go look at the JavaScript all the time and write a test based on that. You really do have to work it through a platform and build out your click streams. I think that's been a challenge, especially around automation.
Right. It has. Man Systems does provide, so if you were going to go full on, right, with Man Systems Digital Factory, they provide the tools that you might be used to in other areas. So they have a CI/CD tool, they have a code reviewer tool, and they have ATS tool. And so you could set up a pipeline where on commit, you had the release get scanned for code review. You had it get regression tested with ATS, or you had it automatically get deployed somewhere, and you can kind of create your own workflows in there. And right. Again, you're limited to the one or two things that are out there because of how niche this market is, right? You don't have a lot of different options, and you're not going to buy a lot of off-the-shelf things unless you go with it. And it's not like the tools aren't good. They're good. But I know when you work with languages and you work with technologies, if you're looking for something that's going to give you more options, right? It's like driving a Honda Civic, right? There's plenty of aftermarket parts and aftermarket part builders, right?
Yes.
But if you
Right.
try something a little more specific like a Bentley, you may only have one or two people that you can actually buy parts from, right?
I think
And
it's
you're
a
gonna be
requirement
limited.
that if you drive a Bentley, you can't do anything to it. You just have to leave it
You
as
just
it
got to
is.
keep it as is, right?
Yeah, I think that's how that goes. And you're right. Mendix isn't quite like that. There are some things you can do. It is customizable. I don't want to make it sound like you can't do anything,
Yeah.
but it is different. It's a little. It requires, again, to be thinking about it in the Mendix way of how am I going to go about this? How am I going to build this out? How do I have my pipeline? But then, we also do things like we use the platform API to take a backup of our application every night and restore it to another environment for another purpose, right? Yes, you can do that in any language, but that's a pretty simple script that runs. I think it runs through Jenkins. It calls the API, copies a backup, puts it in another place, restarts it, does all those things, and it's scripted all through the API. And that's pretty flexible. But then you mentioned earlier, we have environment refreshes so that we can have a really robust QA environment. And when we refresh all of our apps, I think there's like 7 or 8 main apps, and we refresh, what do we do? UAT, QA, and test across 7 or 8 apps. It's 20 plus environments that we're refreshing.
Plus performance. Plus
Oh, yeah.
performance.
Oh, my goodness. So it's probably 28 or 30. It takes a week, right? We plan those out. Again, that's a challenge. Not only of low code, but that's just operating at scale, and it has a new flavor, the things you have to be thinking about when you're talking low code. But you're involved in those. Those take all week.
Right, they do. And you have less control, right? Like in a traditional environment, you may say, I'm going to refresh QA and we're only going to limit it to 30 days of production data, right? I'm going to put in the last 30 days. We have to do this big bang, do it all, unless we pull down our database and did some processing on it locally, right? And as I'm thinking about this out loud, I may bring this up as a thing to do, and then figure out a new database to upload that only has 30 days worth of data in it. And we could write some scripts to clean out the database and then re-upload it, and that may be the better way to go. But again, you have to be ingenuitive, right? Like we've been doing this for a long time, and I just happened to think of that as we were talking out loud about this, right? But
it's funny you say that too, because well, that just came up earlier this week as we were trying to figure out what had happened, why we were suddenly sending so many emails to this weird address. Well, it turned out that there was the way we had one of the test environments configured, it was looking at all of the production data that no longer matched what it was seeing with test, and was like, yeah, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. And in production, we want to know that. Right. But in test and QA, we don't. So we black hole that message, but it was actually going to a real, what looked like a real domain, so it was all being dropped. But maybe that's a way to make that refresh better if we did, go carve out the data we really wanted there. That's interesting.
Yeah, something to think about. So as we come in, we're getting to the end of our time here, and I think I'm going to leave one last statement about this, is that you can do anything you want in Mendix as long as you learn how to do it in Mendix.
Yeah. I think that'll be the headline of this episode, right? That will be while we're talking about challenges, you do have to learn how to work in the right way. You have to learn how to do it the Mendix way. And I have struggled with it, over and over, because I have so many years of not Mendix experience that I want to apply to it. And then we have to go find the right way. But that's a great point, that you have to learn to do it in Mendix.
So today we talked about the challenges of implementing. We talk about it in the frame of low code, but really about implementing a software development organization at a large enterprise environment. We talked about recruiting talent and keeping talent there, the availability of people in the Mendix pool and the low code class. We talked about a mindset when it comes to the Mendix way and how to do things, in the low code way, and release any kind of previous habits or preconceptions about how software development should go, and just truly understand what the low-code platform is trying to get you to do.
Right.
We talked about DevOps processes, hosting, availability of sites, and kind of how that works in this environment. And we touched a bit about test and QA automation, and just a very little bit about audit and compliance. But so what are we going to talk about next week, Steve?
Yeah, I think next week I'd like to dive into a little bit more of how we're using Mendix, maybe with some more specifics. Talk about what it really looks like at scale. You mentioned going from one app to 24. We're in a microservice environment. We don't just write in Mendix. We have a ton of apps that we've written. Some low code, some React, some Java, some I'm not even sure. We have some
stuff. Yeah, we have a lot.
Yeah, there's
a few different stacks.
Yeah,
we have Ruby apps.
Quite a few things that are in there, and I think so. I'd like to talk about some of that as part 3 of our low code at scale, and I think I would also like to talk about some of the things for other software professionals to think about as it relates to low code and audit and compliance. That's super near and dear to my heart because we're in the middle of a pretty big project. There's some good things and some really challenging things about Mendix, and maybe a little, we would touch on kind of the attitudes of, how an audit looks at low code versus something that's more well established in the US, like a .NET framework or a Java framework or something like that more auditors probably have a better chance of understanding. So we'll narrow that scope down some, but I think that that's probably part 3 of our low code at scale. I hope everybody has enjoyed this, and thanks for the recap. That was really good. And I've enjoyed this conversation, and I hope that our listeners, and we appreciate all that we're hearing from you guys. It's fantastic. Please continue to reach out. Please continue with the feedback. We love it. We're always looking for more things to talk about. If there are topics that, we only touched on or didn't touch on at all that you'd like to know about, we want to hear. We're always open to suggestions.
Right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Architect and the Executive, a podcast by Imran Kassam and Steve Ledwith. We hope you enjoyed this episode and encourage you to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. All of our episodes, show notes, and articles can be found on our website, thearchitectandtheexecutive.com. Thank you.